Welcome to this IISS panel discussion on continuing the Trident debate, the role, alternatives, and opportunity cost. A year ago in this room, we hosted a highly acclaimed discussion meeting with four distinguished statesmen on the foreign policy implications of the Trident replacement decision. Today we're joined by four other distinguished parliamentarians who will tackle some of the key issues regarding the issue, the implications and options that the United Kingdom will have to face in the leading up to the 2016 Main Gate decision. We thought this would be a timely point of time to discuss these issues. Last summer was the Trident Alternatives Review. Next year, in May, the general election will be focusing on this issue. But today we thought then we could talk about the role, the system options, the deterrence postures, and the opportunity costs of the Trident replacement. As I said, we have four distinguished parliamentarians. I won't read their bios, but just introduce them briefly. Sir Nick Harvey, Liberal Democrat MP and former Minister of State for the Armed Forces, who's been involved in this debate very intently. Dr. Julian Lewis, Conservative MP and former Shadow Defense Minister, has also been intimately involved in the Trident debate over the years. Baroness Shirley Williams, a Liberal Democrat peer and co-founder of the Social Democratic Party, currently a professor emeritus at Harvard University, among other positions. Shirley graciously agreed to join the panel literally at the last moment, so she won't have been on the invitation we sent out, but for balance and symmetry, she's agreed to join the panel. And Admiral Lord Alan West, a Labour peer and former Sea Lord and Chief of Naval Staff, among other former and current titles. So let's begin the discussion with a brief overview of what role and purpose the UK Trident system serves. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give a short answer to the questions: what is the essential role for the UK Trident, and what threats or risks does Britain's Trident system address? Nick, could we start with you, please?
Yes, by all means, and it's a difficult question to answer, because if you go back to the height of the Cold War, when we had a known nuclear adversary who we believed could and conceivably might attack at a moment's notice, there was a logic, you might or might not have subscribed to it, but there was a logic to having a nuclear deterrent on constant patrol, because we thought they could strike at a moment's notice. We needed to be in a position also to strike at a moment's notice, and thus it was that we subscribed to a balance of terror. All that changed very fundamentally when the Cold War came to an end, and in 1994 we and the Russians de-targeted each other. It would have made, in my view, perfect sense at that time to have ceased continuous at-sea deterrence, not to have given up the deterrent altogether, but to have ceased CAS-D. Instead, we have sustained it ever since, a gargantuan effort by the Royal Navy, for which I can only pay a fulsome tribute to them and to the supply chain behind them. But for what exact practical utility, it's very much more difficult to discern. Our national security strategy now deems this to be a second-tier threat. It's said to be a very low likelihood that we would ever come under nuclear attack. And indeed, since the 1998 Strategic Defence Review, we have actually had the submarines on several days' notice to fire. So it clearly is not fulfilling its original purpose, and I would contend that it's very debatable whether it is fulfilling any practical utility at all.
Thanks very much. Julian, I think you have a different point of view.
A very different point of view, and I'll resist the temptation to get into the debate with Nick just at this point. I will simply say that armed forces in peacetime are an insurance policy against future military threats. The odds are that those future military threats, when they arise, will not have been predicted long in advance and may not have been predicted significantly in advance at all. No one can know what threats will arise over the next 50 years, and it is the period of the next 50 years that by the time the successor to Trident, to the Trident boat fleet is built, although Trident as a missile will continue, that is the time scale for which it will be deployed. I'm very surprised to hear that the idea that the Cold War could never come back is still being promoted quite as forcefully this week as it was last month, because I would have thought that events concerning the Ukraine have shown only too well how quickly and how unpredictably a threat can arise. Just imagine what would have happened if instead of doing what he's done in the Ukraine, Putin had decided to do what he's done in the Ukraine to one of the Baltic states. Or just imagine that we had been unwise enough to let Georgia and the Ukraine into NATO with the guarantee that an attack on them would have instantly involved the United States and the European allies and all the other members of NATO in a war with the aggressor. So I think recent events show only too well that armed forces in peacetime are an insurance policy against the unknown, and Trident and the continuous deterrent, and I hope we'll obviously be discussing that aspect in more detail later, are the ultimate insurance policy against the ultimate threat.
Thanks very much. Shirley, could I ask your point of view on this?
Yes, I'm very influenced by the feeling that in the United Kingdom we've got Trident disproportionately dominating our argument. We almost seem to forget that we're members of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. We almost seem to forget that issues like, for example, trying to find a peaceful outcome from the whole issue of a possible nuclear deterrent in Iran is the absolute first importance. In other words, we really have to stop thinking almost entirely in terms of these islands and start thinking much more in terms of the world. I was a member of the ICCND, the International Committee on Nuclear Development and Nuclear Disarmament, which was run by the Japanese and Australian governments. In that capacity, I spent 2 years going around the world. In most parts of the world, Trident was not really on the agenda. To be quite honest, it was regarded as essentially marginal. The key questions were whether we could, in fact, get an answer to the issues of Iran, which I think, thanks to Cathy Ashton and other words, we've begun to do. And secondly, how we were to deal with the psychotic state known as North Korea, which is unlikely to be influenced by any deterrent at all because it doesn't care about its populations. Therefore, my argument would be that if we can contribute to the strengthening of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, if we can make sure that we stop proliferation in its tracks, and of course there are real dangers because of the wish of some of the Sunni powers to follow a nuclear track, then in a way Trident becomes irrelevant. It's not going to be particularly effective in stopping that kind of thing happening. To my mind, and you may or may not disagree with me, the real rising threat is cyber warfare. I think it's very striking to me that the Department of Defense was extremely slow to getting around even to thinking seriously about cyber warfare. But when one sees, for example, as a small case, what Russia did to Estonia and how it virtually knocked out the whole of its infrastructure in electricity and areas like that, I have to say that I think in some ways Trident to me looks rather like the Maginot Line did to the French in 1938. In other words, I think it's a weapon of the past. So sticking my neck out, I would say, don't remove it immediately. I think it's a case for using it as a bargaining and negotiating tool. But I think the real argument in front of us is what are the real threats in the future. I agree with Julian Lewis on that. What we don't agree is what the threats are. I don't think they're primarily nuclear. I think they're primarily cyber.
Thank you very much, Shirley. And Alan,
Yeah,
this round.
I'm being a simple sailor. You said answer this in one sentence, so but clearly that's gone to the wall. I mean, my sentence would have been, I suppose, that in a highly dangerous and unpredictable and chaotic world, that Trident provides the ultimate insurance and safeguard for our nation's security against major external threat and nuclear blackmail. That would be what I would say as a sentence for that. In regards to I think your second part was talking about in SDSR 2010, what were the tiers, who would it apply to? When you look at those tiers, I think it actually applies to state-on-state primarily. Does state-on-state count? It's right. A lot of people have disregarded it. I think recent events show we would be very stupid to disregard that. I think history show we would be very stupid to disregard that. And therefore, I think we have to remember that as the world changes and as threats change, so you need to have this ultimate insurance policy to look after your security.
Thanks very much. So both of you and Julian have talked about the insurance policy. I wonder if I could ask the Lib Dems on the panel here, if they could just address that specific issue. Does that make sense, that that Trident, the main purpose is as an insurance policy for unknown future threats? Nick, do you want to take that?
Well, it's important to remember that the UK government subscribes to and believes the 1996 advisory ruling from the International Court of Justice that the only circumstances in which it would be legal to use or threaten the use of nuclear weapons are when the state faces an existential threat. They are not there, and it is neither their stated nor their inherent purpose. They are not there to deter anything other than an existential threat. So the idea that they are some sort of comprehensive insurance policy against anything that might threaten us is simply flawed. They are there for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to deal with a situation where we face an existential threat. So I think there is an argument for the time being for retaining our nuclear know-how and our capability as some sort of an insurance policy against an unknown future, against the possibility that we might in the future develop a nuclear adversary who had got the combination of intent and capability, which we have no adversary possessing at the moment. But that is not a justification or a rationale for patrolling the seas 24/7, waving weapons of mass destruction at, nobody in particular, because there's nobody out there who has currently got any intention of using them against us.
Yes, Julian, I know you have.
Well, I wish I had Nick's foresight to be so sure that if somebody did have the intention to pose an existential threat to this country, that we would know about it before the 4-minute warning went off. The whole point about the British strategic minimum deterrent is that it has always served one purpose, which is precisely to prevent the obliteration or the blackmail of this country on threat of obliteration by another country which, unlike us, might not take the advisory ruling of an international court quite so seriously. Because the fact is that just because law-observing democracies would only dream of using a weapon like this in response to an existential threat as a weapon of last resort doesn't mean that the people who are likely to pose such a threat will be bound by the same limitations or will kindly let us know when they're gearing up in advance to pose such a threat, such as it has to be said Nick's party's policy implies by suggesting we should be sending Trident boats to sea, leaving all the warheads ashore at Coolport in a single target, so that when the situation gets really critical, they can all sail back in a fast-lane direction and put all these warheads on the ship whilst the enemy stands idly by very sportingly waiting for us to rearm them, send them all around the oceans of the world before it would dream of launching an attack.
But the
reality, one more sentence if I may, the reality of it is that when you look back at all the historical attempts to predict we won't have to face a war for another 10 years, when they look back at that in 1931 when trying to decide whether to get rid of the 10-year rule, Lord Hankey came to the conclusion that in 1914, far from having 10 years warning of all those actions and reactions that led to the First World War, they had barely 10 days warning.
Can I
Can you
maybe
hold on
just...
just a second?
Yes, I mean, I suppose I agree entirely, I have to say, with what Julian said, but just 2 points to add to that. As a military man, if I would belong to a nation that actually had a bone to pick with the UK and we got to a position where there was going to be something very unpleasant, the time I would preempt would be to take out the most dangerous part of that nation's response to my actions if they were going to affect their survival, and that would be to take out their nuclear weapons if I felt I could do it. By not having them deployed, you can do it. I can write away, I could do that, I could go away from here and tell you how to do it. With it deployed at sea, you can't. My second point is we forget, I think, in times of peace, how nice that we can, because it is, basically we are in time of peace in this country, how emotions and how people change. Who would have thought, you know, at the beginning of the First World War, there'd have been unrestricted U-boat warfare? It was considered absolutely beyond the pale, but it happened. Who would have thought in 1939 that we would firebomb major cities with the intent of killing the population, to the extent of stopping the raid halfway through, sending out radio messages, cyber-type attack actually, to tell the population to come out of their area shelters to the central station, and then bombing the central station again. No one would have dreamt it. And that is the point. People do terrible things, and I believe this is an insurance policy to stop it happening to us.
Can I just break in? Because once again, the conversation has poured straight back into the UK. Let's be quite honest. The most dangerous thing that could possibly happen today would be for another attack on Mumbai, followed by an Indian response blowing up Pakistan. That's why the warning system, the issue of countries which have nuclear weapons which are not under proper control, the fact that there is a great deal of nuclear material throughout the world which is not properly locked up or properly safeguarded, is absolutely central. It's much more likely that the threat will come from there and then lead on to a major war in which we would be involved, than that Trident would be the correct response to the kinds of threats we're under. And let me just say a couple of things, because I've lived with this for a while, and I still am amazed that in the United Kingdom we address it so little. If you look at the impact of a nuclear war, whether or not there's a nuclear winter, clearly there are going to be huge numbers of casualties and huge amounts of environmental destruction, to the point where there's a real question about whether it's in the interest of any country to loose a nuclear weapon on another country because of the wider effects beyond that country's own borders, which are, you know, I went to Japan and lived in Hiroshima for a week to write the report of the ICCND, and you could see there the effect of utter nuclear destruction. I'm not preaching a pacifist case, but I am preaching very strongly the argument that at the most the Trident should be seen as a transitional deterrent to other countries. I don't actually believe we need it, but still other people do, and I respect Admiral West as a military leader. So if we believe that, then what we want, I think, is a slow downwards escalation in which we begin by reducing the number of channels on the ships, possibly reducing the number of ships to 3 or even 2, recognizing that within 10 years we're certainly to be looking at different answers to this issue. And I'm quite troubled by the fact that in this brief discussion so far, absolutely nobody's taken up any of the global issues, such as the future of the NPT and all the rest of it. And that's where the real dangers are. Final point, more than 50% of the 23,000 nuclear weapons in the world are on 6-minute or 8-minute alert. Stop for just a minute and think what that means in a country like Pakistan. Your telephone wires aren't very good. You get a lot of interference. You may not have 8 minutes to decide whether or not you respond to an attack upon you or you attack somebody else. We're living in a terribly fragile world, and the fragility is not whether we have Trident on a permanent casualty basis or Trident on an occasional intervening basis. The central issues are not there. They really aren't. And so when we discuss that, we should contribute to trying to get a more sensible world where warning times are issued, where we look at the NPT and try to sustain it, where we thank God that so far it looks as if Iran under Rouhani is becoming a more sensible country.
But Charlie, I think all of us would agree that those are the good things. I think most of us actually at heart are multilateralists at heart, but we've done really well in this country in terms of reducing down to one system only. We've actually reduced our number of warheads dramatically. We've reduced the number of missiles. We don't have them on immediate readiness to fire. You know, we've done some really remarkable and really good things, I think. Sadly, most countries have not followed us down that route. I agree entirely we should put pressure on to do that, but I don't believe that invalidates our need for the moment to keep Trident at this minimum level and CASD.
Can I ask you can I ask just one question? I promise, very short.
The chairman is losing control.
It's directly relevant to that. I, as you know, was an advisor to Gordon Brown on the subject of proliferation for about 2 years. Whatever one thinks about Gordon Brown, I actually think he's being badly treated by history. But the point was that he actually got quite right. He reduced the number of channels, the number of boats to the absolute bare minimum that would be effective. You're absolutely right. I think he's the only Prime Minister I know of who tried to do that. and the only Prime Minister who set an example that some other countries followed, including Indonesia, which publicly decided not to pursue nuclear weapons.
Nick, as a reward for your patience, I'm going to give you the last word in this round, and then we're going to move on to another set of questions.
I think in order to understand the propensity of anybody else to attack us with a nuclear weapon, you do actually just have to contemplate briefly the impact that using a nuclear weapon would have. If we were to unleash the payload of one of our Trident submarines, that would be a force some 250 times what was unleashed at Hiroshima. The consequences would not simply be felt in the country or the area that we targeted. The impact would be global. There would be a profound impact globally. Now, nobody is going to unleash that lightly. If you stop and consider the economic consequences as well as the strategic and military consequences of using a nuclear weapon, this is not an option that anybody would use lightly. And the idea that we are going to spring a new nuclear adversary of whom we know nothing at 4 minutes' notice is completely up with the fairies. And if by any chance we did, we wouldn't be able to target them and unleash a riposte in the course of the 4 minutes in any case. We would see a deterioration in the security picture in advance, and if we had retained, as I suggest, our nuclear capability, we would have to gear it up onto a patrolling basis. But we are not going to spring a new adversary from nowhere. Yes, the Russians are being more aggressive, but they are a million miles away from unleashing nuclear weapons. If they wanted to bring the country to a standstill, they could do that at a moment's notice through a concerted cyber attack or by turning the gas off or any number of ways that wouldn't have the catastrophic consequences, not least for them and their own citizens, that unleashing a nuclear weapon would have.
Okay, well, thanks very much. That was a stimulating discussion. We'll hold off a minute for your question, Richard. I want to talk about alternatives. The Trident Alternatives Review concluded that there are alternatives to Trident that would enable the United Kingdom to be capable of inflicting significant damage such that most potential adversaries would be deterred, including non-continuous postures as an alternative. However, the review also noted that none of the alternative systems and postures offers the same degree of resilience as the current posture of CASD, nor could they guarantee a prompt response in all circumstances. The limitations of other options included not being able to unilaterally deter major nuclear powers like Russia without Allied support, and a significant increase in vulnerability. The question I'd like to pose to the panelists is, in your judgment, to what extent are any of the 4 alternative delivery systems as outlined in the Trident Alternatives Review credible and effective minimum deterrent systems? Sir Nick, maybe I could ask you to address in particular the question of that the Alternatives Review concluded that operating without a continuous at-sea presence would require political confidence regarding certain possible conditions, including one, that a no-notice preemptive attack would not be launched when the UK was operating without a boat deployed, the kind of issue that Julian raised, and 2, that patrolling could be reconstituted before a potential period of heightened tension arises, and 3, that patrolling can be sustained to cover any crisis. How confident could a government be in satisfying these conditions regarding nuclear submarines in a non-continuous at-sea posture?
Well, I mean, it is certainly the case, and nobody, I think, would pretend any different, that if you go for a lesser system or for a different posture, you are not going to have as much resilience as you have from 24/7 patrolling with an intercontinental ballistic missile. But I think we will come on in the latter part of this discussion to discuss the opportunity cost of maintaining all of that, and the fact that it is now constituting a far bigger part of much smaller defence than it was when we originally scaled our nuclear deterrent at this size back in 1980 at the height of the Cold War. If we had a different posture, we would have to so design it that we had the confidence that we could put it back together and get ourselves onto patrol as quickly as we thought there was any material possibility of a threat presenting itself. Now, clearly, if you believe that a threat is possible, as imminently as Julian believes it is possible, there is no scope for having anything other than 24/7 patrols. If you believe, as I do, that we face no threat now, and that if we were going to face a material threat in the future from a rational actor who could be deterred, we would see that coming and we would be able to put a patrol back together that would address many of the issues you have touched at in that introduction. So far as the system itself is concerned, an intercontinental ballistic missile with the firepower that we currently set it up at is designed to overcome Moscow's defences, because in 1980 that was the way we thought, it was the only way we thought you could deter monolithic Soviet USSR. The Russia of 2014, although it might be beginning to display some of the same disagreeable tendencies in its foreign policy, is a very, very, very different country. And you would be well able to deter the Russians from considering the catastrophic use of nuclear weapons through a much more diverse set of targets than you would have had to have overcome in 1980 to disturb the Kremlin in its bunker.
Julian, your view on the concerns about a non-continuous at-sea posture?
Absolutely, thank you. I think that was a really useful contribution from Nick, because it brings us to the heart of the issue, and I would just take exception to one word he used. He said, if you believe in the threat as imminently as Julian does. Now, it's not that I believe that the threat is imminent. I don't know when that threat might be made. It might be made at any time over the future projected lifetime of our strategic minimum deterrent system. The point about it is not that it's imminent, but that if it ever becomes a reality, we won't have any significant period of advance warning about it. Now, I think Nick made a very important concession. Other than using that word imminent, he said, if you believe the threat is as real as that, then you need continuous deterrence. And that is my case. Not that I believe that you need continuous deterrence because the threat is imminent, but that you need continuous deterrence because you will never know when the threat becomes imminent until it happens, and by then it will be too late for all concerned. I'm going to read out, if I may, my favourite ever quotation about deterrence. And it goes back to the late great defence scientist, Professor Sir Henry Tizard, who between 1944 and 1945 was commissioned to head a committee of leading scientists, the scientific advisors to all the armed forces at the end of the Second World War. And this Tizard committee was forbidden, actually, as early as 44, 45, though it knew about the atomic bomb project. It was forbidden to go into detail about it in its study of what the nature of a future war might be like when World War II was over. But Sir Henry couldn't resist pointing out something which is as true today as it was when he pointed it out at the time, namely that deterrence doesn't depend on uncertainty, it depends on certainty. In order to deter, you've got to be able to threaten retaliation that is unacceptable, but it's also got to be unavoidable. If you just threaten retaliation which is unacceptable, but there is a significant chance that it might not be imposed on you, you might get away without incurring it, then you cannot necessarily rely on deterrence working. And this is what Sir Henry said. Don't bother to write it down, because I have Jenny Nielsen's permission to say that it's in this little booklet, and I've got a supply of them there if anyone wants to pick one up. And it goes like this: a knowledge that we were prepared in the last resort to do this, and what he was talking about was to use the atomic bomb in retaliation, might well deter an aggressive nation. Dueling was a recognized method of settling quarrels between men of high social standing, as long as the duelists stood 20 paces apart and fired at each other with pistols of a primitive type. If the rule had been that they should stand a yard apart with pistols at each other's hearts, we doubt whether it would long have remained a recognized method of settling affairs of honor. In other words, an aggressor will not be likely to commit his aggression if he knows that the retaliation is not only unacceptable but unavoidable. Very briefly then on the systems, my reading of the Trident Alternatives report was that none of the alternative systems to Trident offered anything like the same level of security of response, and the only question in that report was whether you should have a 3-boat or a 4-boat force and whether or not the patrols needed to be continuous. And I think my answer to that question as to whether it needs to be continuous comes back to this point about certainty. It is obviously better that an aggressor should be uncertain that you won't respond, but it's far better that he should be certain that you will respond, because that way he won't be tempted to take a gamble, because no gamble will be involved. That's why it used to be called mutual assured destruction. And it's not only the destruction that's important for deterrence, it is the assuredness too.
Thank you very much, Julian. Admiral West, one of the arguments against the non-continuous posture is that in a time of crisis, if boats are deployed, it increases the sense of tension, the escalation. Is that a reasonable concern? Can that escalation risk be managed?
I think the answer is it can escalate things. I think some people have maybe made too much of it. My main concern, I go back to the point as a military man, if I was getting to the position where I was thinking of doing something, if I knew that that system was in a position where I can actually take it out, then I would propose as a military man to my political leaders, we need to do this now, because then that option is off the table for them. That would be more important to me. But I think, yes, you could argue that it will raise tension and things, but I think people have made too much of it. I think they've made more of it than is a real point. But yes, it would escalate things without a doubt as you start saying, you know, as the preparations get known of and you sail boats, that would do that. But I don't think that's the main reason I'm against it. I think that certainty, and you know, Nick did say no threat now. That's a really dangerous thing. I mean, as military, you've got to, you're meant to be looking at options. I mean, the options there are on the MOD for actions that all of us, if we saw them, make your hair stand on end. You think, my God, what on earth are they thinking of? Our job is to think of all of these things, and we can never predict. We don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's the core of it. We have no idea in a very dangerous, very uncertain world. None of us can predict that, as I say, and people change. We saw that, you know, in the Second World War, First World War. Those things are important. There was a mention of cost. The alternatives, several of them cost an awful lot more than what we've got at the moment without actually providing the same capability. So we need to be quite careful about that. There's no doubt that nuclear weapons and the possession of them by NATO and others stopped World War in the second half of the 20th century, I believe, and actually let us win the Cold War, thank goodness for Europe and for the world. But as I say, I think if we're looking at this in cost terms, there are some things that are more important than cost. I get a bit worried. I mean, yes, there is a balance always, but there are some things that are very, very important, and where you put that cost level then is important. I think, for example, just generally defence on its own in this country has probably fallen too low, as it's the prime responsibility of government. You know, I think that's unfortunate. There is also a delusion amongst some people in the military. They think that if we were able to save money in Trident, if we were, and I say a lot of these options are more expensive, that money somehow would go to creating a few more battalions or get a few more. They are deluding themselves. I've dealt with the Treasury now for many years. You've got to remember who your real enemy are. There's no way you'd ever get that money out.
Okay, you're preempting me a little bit on about the opportunity costs, but let's just stick for one more, for Shirley to say something about the alternatives. And I was going to ask you, what signal is sent, political signal or other signal, if Britain were to go to a non-continuous at-sea posture? But I think you also wanted to say something else about this.
Well, on the non-continuous at sea, that's where I rest as a transient deterrent. I think that's quite right. But let me just say one word. I mean, first of all, it's going to be hugely costly, and you're going to have a great many people in the public saying, why should we actually watch the NHS get into terrible trouble in order to fund a continuous at sea deterrent? And that will be a very powerful argument, which will be very effective with the electorate, I think. But let me just say one other thing. It really addresses Julian Lewis's argument to some extent. I serve on the board of the Nuclear Threats Initiative in the United States in Washington, D.C., along with people like Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar and others. One of the things that has come right up the agenda, to the top almost, is whether Michael Quinlan's great belief in mutually assured destruction operates at all with certain countries, and it was Nick who used the phrase rational actors. North Korea, we think increasingly, is not a rational actor. And we suspect that North Korea is a country which would put the saving of the regime ahead of the damage to its citizens, of risking a nuclear attack in retaliation to anyone that it itself was willing to launch. In other words, we now have a situation where there are some clearly not at all rational actors out there. They wouldn't be affected by CASD. From their point of view, CASD would be almost welcome, because they're prepared, like Gotterdammerung, to go down in flames rather than see the present regime disappear. None of this addresses the issue of the non-rational actor. I wouldn't have taken it very seriously either. But after several meetings at NTI, where it's quite clear that people realise that, at least in the case of North Korea, you cannot assume that deterrent has any effect at all. We're looking at a very different world than we thought we were. And in that situation, CASD would be almost completely pointless, except as an additional reason why North Korea would say that it had to act before anybody acted against it.
Thank you. I want to just follow up one question on the signals that are sent by any change, or the signals sent by a non-change. I mean, for example, Julian, if you've argued before, and Al has just argued, that changes that Britain might make to its deterrence posture won't affect anybody else's decisions. But does maintaining the deterrence posture...
Sorry, can I just... I mean, it wouldn't affect the decision of an enemy. It can have quite a political consequence. That's a different issue in terms of alliances and other signals.
That's the question I was getting to. Want to continue with another sentence or two to answer that? And
well,
if others want to...
I think for us to move down the route which is, in a sense, changing our posture to the degree where you're moving towards perhaps a unilateralism, actually, would be very damaging to the NATO alliance. I think it would be very damaging to our linkage to the United States. I have no doubt whatsoever. We talk of the special relationship. The special relationship, in reality, is the nuclear and intelligence relationship. That is the special relationship. In that sense, we are joined at the hip. That is the thing that really keeps us linked together. I think it would be very damaging indeed, for us to change that unilaterally without thinking about it. It would damage the alliance. I think it would be very unwelcome in some capitals in Europe. I think the Germans, I know from my discussions with the Germans, they would not be at all happy if suddenly our nation were not a sensible nuclear player. They wouldn't be happy with that. So it would have impact, I believe, politically in that sense.
Nick, you were shaking your head, and then I'm going to go to you, Julian, for the last word.
I mean, I think we look at this in far too binary a way. We think that we either have to continue exactly as we do things at the moment, with a deterrent that was scaled to the threat of 1980. It's referred to as an insurance policy, but it's an insurance policy with a quite unacceptable premium and a completely unnecessary level of cover. I think that our relationship with America is three-cornered. Yes, it's nuclear, yes, it's intelligence, but far more important than either of those is the willingness to turn up and take part in coalitions of the willing to sustain a broad spectrum of military capability and the willingness to use it. And the fact of the matter is that the sustaining of a Cold War level nuclear deterrent now poses, in my view, a serious threat to our ability to sustain in the long term broad spectrum capabilities that can make a worthwhile contribution to international efforts. And that is why, for example, Gates, in his book when he's retired from the political scene in America, and others in the US have commented that Britain is struggling to afford both to sustain this level of nuclear deterrent and to retain a broad spectrum of military capabilities, and we need to make a decision which it is. I think It's far more important that we maintain a broad spectrum of military capabilities. I don't think the nuclear thing has to be either or. I think there is a whole ladder of different possibilities in terms of our nuclear deterrent and nuclear posture, and that actually beginning to identify that ladder and to take some steps down, it would not have the negative effects that Alan is referring to, but actually would be welcomed internationally and not least by many of our allied countries.
Can I just clarify? So Nick is saying that the money, if there were money savings in Trident, would go straight back into the defence budget. Is that the... I'm interested if that's the Lib Dem view.
I'm not saying
you're trying to trick question.
Neither as a party policy nor as a prediction of what would happen. But what I, and I know we're going to come on in a minute to the opportunity cost, there is a vast list of essential military projects that need to be paid for out of the defence budget during the same period that the spend on a new generation of nuclear deterrent is going to be at its height. Now, Philip Hammond has done a superb job in getting the Ministry of Defence budget into balance, but it is not going to stay that way for very long unless something gives. The fact of the matter is we cannot afford the things I will list in a minute and the nuclear deterrent out of the existing budget. There is not going to be magic money from the Treasury to pay for the nuclear deterrent, and something will have to give. And if it's not taking a few steps down the nuclear ladder, it will be our conventional forces and the ability of those forces to go to different parts of the globe and mount expeditionary warfare. And that is a hard fact. The defence budget is not big enough and isn't going to be big enough over the next 10 or 15 years to pay for all of the things that people are taking for granted.
Now that we've segued into the opportunity cost and two people have weighed in on it, Julian, I'd like you to say whatever you'd like to say about alternatives, and then if you'd like to talk about alternative costs, or you get another round, another chance on the opportunity cost. Okay.
Okay, if I could, I'd rather there's such important issues being raised so far. First of all, I must just say I've just spotted Professor Sir Michael Howard in the front row here, and Michael will be able to...
Still keeping the faith.
Yeah, indeed. Michael, who was my guru when I was an undergraduate, will be able to confirm that when I say I've been banging on about these things for about 40 years, as it was in about 1971, I think that mathematics is probably about right. And there is an advantage to having gone on about the same sort of subject for the last 40 years, and that is that most of what you hear put forward in arguments for today's scenario, which people think is something new and something terribly original and something has changed and it's all different from the way it was before, are in fact very similar and often identical arguments to those that you had to fight all the way through those previous decades. For example, I'm sorry to say to Shirley, but it's not some great discovery that there may be people on the world scene today who may not be rational actors. The argument about nuclear deterrence presupposing rationality on the part of the person you're trying to deter is as old as the argument about deterrence itself. And even before I met you, Sir Michael, I can remember at the age of about 13 in 1964 seeing a cartoon by that great anti-totalitarian cartoonist, the late Michael Cummings, showing, I think it must have been Kennedy and Khrushchev, I think it would have been around about that time, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're each holding a giant H-bomb, and they're both looking down apprehensively at a tiny prancing figure of Chairman Mao with a little test tube and a mini mushroom cloud coming out of it. And one is saying to the other something about, now I can see what you mean about not always being able to deter, or something like that. Everybody thought that when Mad Mao got the bomb, then all considerations of deterrence would go out of the window. The reality is, as anybody who's observed China has seen, that China has actually followed a very rational policy, even under Mao, of strategic minimum deterrence. But even if I accepted Shirley's point that none of this applies to a regime like North Korea. And even if I accepted the revisionist argument, which I don't, that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that the fanatical Japanese promptly decided that they had to surrender. But even if I accepted all that, that would be no argument for saying that just because Britain having a strategic minimum deterrent might not deter all enemies in all scenarios, and certainly won't deter people taking action against us at the sub-nuclear level, such as invading the Falklands or something like that, that therefore it has no purpose at all. I've always used the analogy with somebody who invents a cure for a deadly disease like cancer, which can kill you. And the argument of people who use the sort of arguments I've just been describing is that they say, oh, fat lot of good that drug is, it will only stop you being killed of cancer. What really matters is that you might die of a brain hemorrhage or something completely different. The fact that there are other threats, the fact that there is cyber warfare, the fact that there may be overwhelming conventional threats in different scenarios, all that tells us is that we need a range of capabilities. And finally, I'd like to say this. Nick used a word earlier where he accepted something like that we wouldn't have the same degree of resilience if we had a part-time deterrent rather than continuous at-sea deployment. Resilience has nothing to do with this. This is not something that shades by degrees across a spectrum. Either in any given scenario, the fact that you've got a strategic nuclear deterrent is going to deter your potentially aggressive opponent, or it isn't. There are no two ways about it. And if you go down from the situation that it will certainly, definitely, and unavoidably, and indeed assuredly, be that retaliation will be inflicted on him, then you maximize the chance of deterrence. Once you bring uncertainty into that equation, then somebody may gamble that you won't. And for those people for whom it's more important to try and get a nuclear-free world, and indeed the Lib Dem policy document talks about decoupling, it says that it's contingency posture, which is what it calls this business of a part-time deterrent, would decouple nuclear weapons from the day-to-day calculus of national security and show that the UK can live without nuclear weapons continuously at sea, and these are the key words, ladies and gentlemen, as a precursor to living without nuclear weapons at all.
Absolutely.
Well, indeed. So if your aim is, like Nick's, and I think Shirley's, if your aim is to get rid of our nuclear weapons entirely,
and
then
governments,
to do it, it is not the intention of my party, and it never will be, I earnestly hope, to get rid of our nuclear weapons entirely before any other country has got rid of its as well. And that is why I call this policy the slow boat to unilateralism. The unilateralists know that unilateralism is electorally toxic, and therefore they go to this part-time halfway house as a step on the road to unilateralism, because they know that the people would reject blatant unilateralism just as securely as they did in previous general elections.
A tiny comment that President Obama has specifically said that he believes in moving towards a world without nuclear weapons. It's not a unique kind of Lib Dem ludicrousness. It's actually strongly upheld by a great many leaders.
So I think I'm going to depart from the careful agenda that Jenny Nielsen laid out for me, and not ask about opportunity costs, because it's already come up. But let's address it, because I want to give opportunity to others to weigh in here, and I know there are several. I think we'll take about 3 comments, and then we'll go back to the panel, and then you can address whichever part of the question you want to address, and then unanswered. The questions about opportunity costs that I'm going to not pose right now. So Richard Norton-Taylor, then Paul Ingram, then Norm Dombey.
Can I just say one thing before that? Because Nick mentioned the new system. We need to be totally clear. This is not a new system. Trident is not a new system. We are talking about replacing some submarines that are becoming increasingly old, and I think the recent announcement about refueling Vanguard shows the necessity of them being replaced. So this is not a new system. This is a system that already exists. We are replacing some submarines. And I think people do get confused. I think the media sometimes gets confused. We're not creating something new.
Okay, Richard.
Which one to the Guardian? Could I pick out, well, Julian and Alan West also emphasised the point of insurance policy. And I think Alan West said that you can never predict what's going to happen. You never predict at all. And also the uniqueness, I suppose, of the point of view of the nuclear deterrent or military policy generally, or national security. I think implicitly you were saying that some things are more important than cost. But I think it was Michael Clark, director of RUSI, the other day, said on the question of insurance policy, you wouldn't actually ask the government or the Treasury to build 20 new hospitals just in case there may be a pandemic in the future. So that's, I wanted to ask, is that a sort of comparative which is irrelevant, or is national security and nuclear policy so unique that these kind of arguments, of course, are actually irrelevant? The second point is actually a broader point about the credibility of the nuclear deterrent. Actually, if Russia does start threatening the Baltic states, for example, I mean, would any nuclear weapon that Britain did have be a realistic deterrent and would do anything, especially without the US doing anything, in the event of Russia putting pressure, for example, on the Baltic states?
Okay, I was going to ask for 3 questions. We already got 2 posed, but we'll, Paul Ingram from BASIC.
Okay, so my question is specifically to Julian, because is it not the logic, and it's picking up on that final point, I wanted that conversation to continue. Is it not the logical conclusion from your position that it would be irresponsible and unstable for this country, even multilaterally, to be giving up nuclear weapons, or even going down the ladder, or abandoning CAS-D, because in those interim stages, or even worse, when we achieved a world free of nuclear weapons, it would open up this country to threat of considerable nature from states that could overwhelm it, and that therefore we are caught indefinitely in a situation where we have to continue to deploy nuclear weapons, and indeed then we have to face the possibility that we are providing the very example that the Iranians and other countries would use to acquire their own nuclear weapons when they are in much more imminent danger of strategic attack than we are.
Okay, and if you pass the microphone right back to Norm Dombey.
One comment and 2 questions. The comment is...
Speak a little bit closer to the microphone.
One comment and 2 questions. The comment is South Africa has given up its nuclear weapons, and Sweden has given up its nuclear weapon program. So it is known that, for countries to give up nuclear weapons. The other comment is, the questions are there any circumstances in which the UK could go to war without the US? The second question is, how much should you pay for an insurance policy against an unknown threat? For example, should we be building an insurance policy against the possibility of meteorites from outer space hitting Britain? And if so, how much should we spend on that?
If you just pass the microphone back to you, and Matthew, hold on to that for a minute. And most of the questions were posed, Julian and Alan, to you, but we'll give the others a chance to weigh in too.
Absolutely. I will not boringly go through every single answer. I would urge people to get hold of this booklet, which addresses virtually all of them, and otherwise have a look at my website, where I've done a number of RUSI essays and articles, one called Soldiers Against the Bomb. If you Google that's worth having a look at for more detail. And hopefully there's an article coming out in the next edition of the RUSI Journal. But let's start with Norman's last thing. Would you spend a lot of money defending the country against meteorites? And the answer to that is, if there were reason to believe that this country was going to come under attack from lots of meteorites, as opposed to, whereas on the basis of past history, there has hardly ever been an example that I'm aware of in the lifetime of man that a threat of the destruction of this country by meteorite has occurred, let alone meteorites controlled by human beings who might well have evil intentions towards you. But if all that changed, you see, really, Norman, what you're doing is you're setting up a classic, and so was Richard with his thing about the hospitals and the disease and the epidemic. You're setting up classic Aunt Sally's, because what you're really saying is that because we don't spend vast amounts of money on threats that everybody would regard as frankly ridiculous and not very likely to happen, therefore there is a parallel between that and the threat that we might actually, over the next 50 years, find ourselves drawn in to a military confrontation with another country armed with mass destruction weapons. And one of the things that I often argue in these essays that I commend to you is think of the reverse scenario. Whilst it is true, let's take the example of the Falklands, where people always used to say, fat lot of good Trident was, didn't stop Argentina invading the Falklands. Of course it didn't, because the Argentines knew that democratic and proportionate Britain would never dream of responding to a threat of that sort, or even an invasion of that sort, by obliterating their capital city. But just imagine that the scenario had been reversed. Just imagine that Britain had had no nuclear weapons at the time of the Falklands, and that General Galtieri had had even a half a dozen or a dozen crude atomic warheads and some means of delivering them. Would we then have dared to respond conventionally against a conventional attack on our territory? So the fact of the matter is that the prospect that over the next 50 years we could find ourselves in a standoff or a confrontation with a nuclear-armed country is a lot more credible than either of the scenarios that were given, with the exception that if indeed, Richard, taking your point directly, if indeed there was some terrible new epidemic that really was sweeping around the world, or something that made the need to build more hospitals more credible, we would. Now, Nick says, yes, but there we are, we will see this coming. But all modern history shows that when these wars break out and when these terrible things happen, we get very little warning of them. And the reality of it is that either Britain continues to have a strategic minimum nuclear deterrent, or it doesn't. And the country has shown time and time again, when asked on this matter, that as long as other countries have nuclear weapons, they would like this country to have the ability to retaliate in kind. And that's why we're going now into all these convoluted, indirect ways of partial methods of unilateralism to avoid the fact that what is really wanted here by these people is that we should get rid of nuclear weapons altogether. And Paul, I take your point entirely. The logic of my position is that a nuclear-free world would be a very dangerous place indeed if it left all the other major countries armed to the teeth conventionally and without a reformation in the mind of men, so that countries didn't want to attack each other. And please, let's not mistake the verbal, the tokenism, saying, of course we all want a nuclear-free world. Well, I'll go better than that. I want a weapons-free world. I want a war-free world. If I ruled the world, every day would be the first day of spring. All great stuff. But that's not the world we live in, and as long as there are dangers out there and people armed with mass destruction weapons, I want my country to have a minimum strategic nuclear deterrent. And what's more, we can afford it, we have afforded it, and we will continue to afford it. And if the British people of my party have anything to say to it, he says, going into rant mode, we will spend on that insurance policy.
Okay,
can I
yes,
say
of
a
course,
little bit
you can, but I want to give...
If I may say,
Please.
I mean, on Richard's point, thank you for that opening, because of course, as you know, in 2009, I got from Gordon Brown the money to ensure that should there be a bird flu pandemic, we are able to produce the counter to it at rapid speed around the country, rather than building 40 new hospitals. So I thought that was a rather better way of doing it. So thank you for that. There are other ways of skinning the cat on these things. But anyway, that was how I went about it. So there was a threat, yes, and we countered it. I think there is an issue that we spend on our deterrent, and our armed forces cost It says 2% of GDP. It's actually going down to 1.7, which will be by 2006, percent of GDP. We spend 4% of that 1.7% on the deterrent. That seems to me not an immense amount to spend for this ultimate security blanket, which I believe it actually is. It is not an immense amount. And even that amount, I don't believe, notwithstanding what Nick said, we would get back into defence if it went away. There would be costs of decommissioning, the Treasury would get their way around it, we wouldn't get it for that. So I believe it's not a high premium to pay for that. You talked about would we use a nuclear weapon if Russia invaded the Baltic. I believe what we absolutely should make clear right now as regards the Ukrainian crisis, and I believe the Crimea issue is different, and we should have actually had a contact group meeting much quicker, and I don't think it's been well handled so far, but anyway, I really do believe we should make absolutely clear, NATO as an alliance, that if a country in NATO is suborned or attacked in this way, that the old Article 5 still applies, and that actually means war. And I believe that if you start talking like that, you need to be ensured that you've got your ultimate deterrent. And so far in history, no one's ever dropped an atomic bomb on someone who's got them. And I just think we need to be absolutely clear in our own mind and sure that we don't just get rid of it lightly.
Thank you. Nick, you wanted to weigh in here.
Yes, I mean, Julian mocks and derides those who want to try and bring about a world without nuclear weapons, but he has rather given the game away, that there are more or less no circumstances which he can envisage or which he believes to be practicable in which he would ever support getting rid of them. And I've heard him before speak eloquently about the possibility that the world would be safer if actually more rather than fewer countries had nuclear weapons. And I don't believe that countries having these intrinsically dangerous weapons of mass destruction makes our collective safety greater. I believe it diminishes it. Now, actually, Norman Dombey makes an interesting point, because the prospect of a meteor coming down and hitting us is actually greater than the prospect of a nuclear weapon coming and hitting us. Unfortunately, I know of no current means by which we could prevent that happening, but I'm sure scientists are working on that. The difficulty with the insurance analogy is that an insurance policy pays for you to rebuild your house after it has been flattened, and I suppose that's the point about the pandemic and the hospital. I simply do not believe that one can rationally conclude that the level of nuclear deterrent that we needed at the height of the Cold War is the level of nuclear deterrent that we need for the next 40 or 50 years. That's not to say I can look into a crystal ball and say with certainty that we will never get the re-emergence of a credible nuclear threat such as we had in the Cold War. And that's why I think that until such time as we can bring about a comprehensive multilateral disarmament, there is a strong argument for retaining our nuclear capability. But patrolling 24/7 today against the contingency of a threat that might arise in years or decades to come simply makes no sense.
Can I just have to jump in on a point of fact that Nick says that it's the same as we had in the Cold War. It's not. I mean, for a lot of the Cold War, we had all the V-Force and things like that. But even at the end of the Cold War, we had 192 MIRVs, in other words, independent retargeted things. Now at sea, we have 40.
Well,
so we've done a huge reduction.
Yes.
We don't have WE-177s. We cut the number of missiles there. We detargeted them. It is very different from what we had in the Cold War.
In other words, Alan, we have taken some unilateral steps down the nuclear ladder.
And I think
therefore nothing would prevent us, in all intellectual consistency, from taking further
not at all,
steps
because we
down
then
the nuclear
changed the
ladder.
posture. I mean, I think those reductions were absolutely right and correct. Sadly, it had little impact on other countries in what they did, I'm afraid to say. There are a couple of countries that were mentioned where it did. I don't think it was our reduction that did that, but they could have done something. I think it would be wonderful to get some reductions in the 23,000 warheads held by the US and Russia. I'm a great believer. I would love to be in a world where we could have full multilateral removal of nuclear weapons, but I don't believe in any sense at the moment by us going further By stopping doing CAS, that would affect that. I think it would make us less safe, and until we can make those other moves, I think it would be a very wrong thing to do.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to the audience now. Matthew Harries, Nick Childs, and Colonel Zahir Kazmi in that order, and then we'll come back to the panel and do in the same manner. Matthew.
Hi, my question is to Nick Harvey. We seem to be in this strange situation where, on the one hand, the Liberal Democrats are making the most realistic assessment of today's threats, but on the other hand, they're embracing perhaps the weakest argument for retaining British nuclear weapons and arguing for a hardware option that doesn't seem to make terribly much sense. So on the one hand, the vague idea that bad things might happen in the future doesn't seem to be a very compelling argument for spending a lot of money at a time when we don't have a lot of money. And moving to fewer boats isn't going to save very much money or impress anyone abroad, and least of all, non-nuclear weapon status parties to the NPT. So my question is, why not go the whole hog? Wouldn't it be better for British politics that, notwithstanding the SNP, if we had a mainstream party in Westminster arguing that the world has changed, UK's position in the world has changed, and we don't need nuclear weapons? And why aren't the Liberal Democrats that party?
Thanks, Matthew. Pass the microphone back to Nick Childs in the back row.
Thanks, Nick Childs from the BBC. I'd just like all the panellists really to invite them to answer the question of whether the tone of the debate here in the UK, and to some extent the anguished sort of history of the debate over nuclear weapons, is because the UK still hasn't quite sort of worked out the sort of message of what the strategic vision is of what role the country wants to play in the future on the international stage, and that goes to the questions of, you know, how much of is it worth spending a premium on the insurance policy, or is retaining the level of capability we have now to send a signal to allies, or conversely, you know, reducing that capability, is that to send a signal to allies, or is it to save money, and if so, for what reason? I ask this question because the obvious parallel, as far as our position is concerned, is with France, where they spend even more money on their nuclear deterrent than we do, yet have, you know, just as many certainly defence and strategic conundrums as far as budgets are concerned as the UK does, and yet there isn't the same level, the same debate, or even the same tone of debate over, you know, questioning the future of the plans there. So is it uniquely a UK position, and is it the vision thing? Is it the strategic vision thing as far as the UK is concerned still? Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. And if you bring the microphone over. Oh, here we got one here. Colonel Kazmi.
Right, I'm Zahir Kazmi.
Kazmi.
I came here to basically understand what would it take Britain to have to continue to have a sea-based nuclear deterrent. But what I never realized was that the talk will slightly drift towards Pakistan, and there was a brief mention that probably in that region the weapons are at 4 minutes notice. It isn't so. What I want to briefly say here is that Pakistan exactly knows how to maintain the delicate balance between the always-never dilemma, that our nuclear weapons are always available and are never used unauthorized and at the wrong time. My question is that militaries work on capabilities, and what would exactly constitute an existential threat to the United Kingdom, and who would pose it and at what time? Because the nuclear armed states outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which of these would have the reach to attack the UK? And likewise, the question is that if you have to draw a balance between an assured second strike capability versus a preemptive capability once you don't have an assured second strike capability, and there's a tendency towards go for preemption. So this small spending of 1.5 billion pounds on sea-based nuclear deterrent, wouldn't that be worth it? Thank you.
All right, we have a diversity of questions there. They weren't posed mostly, except for the first one, to Nick. So why don't you go ahead and take that one and answer any of the other points, and then anybody else want to join in?
Yes, well, I mean, the answer to your question is that I do not believe that sending our submarines out currently on 24/7 patrol is fulfilling any military utility. But I can't say with absolute certainty yet that it could never be the case that we would have a nuclear adversary and the need to mount a constant patrol. Therefore, I think there is an argument for retaining the capability and a well-rehearsed plan for putting it back together again, should the situation in the future deteriorate to a point that we once again have an adversary. Now, in point of fact, we've got to the point where we have to make a decision whether we're going to replace the Vanguard submarines for the reasons that Alan West has touched upon. I don't think there is anything wrong with building some more submarines. If we don't, we run the risk that we will lose our submarine building capacity at Barrow. But I only think it is acceptable or worth doing if they are so designed to be capable of fulfilling conventional purposes as well as the nuclear role, because otherwise, at any point between now and about 2070, if any future government decides that they no longer think it's necessary for us to be in the nuclear business, they will end up writing off the huge once-in-a-generation investment that we make. So actually, you know, building some more submarines, having the ability to fire intercontinental ballistic missile with a conventional warhead on it is not a bad capability for us to have as part of a balance of forces. We've got the missile arrangement. We've done a lot of the work on the warhead. The running costs of keeping AWE going are not unacceptably vast. So I think it is practical for the foreseeable future to retain the capability, the components of the deterrent, a highly skilled crew which can, as the Americans used to, can sustain a well-rehearsed routine for putting it all back together again. In the dear hope and expectation that further progress can be made through the non-proliferation treaty and with a keen eye on the intriguing developments that are now happening internationally in terms of a growing awareness and understanding by governments around the world over the humanitarian consequences of using nuclear weapons, which I think the P5 governments fail to understand and to recognise the speed with which this is shifting international opinion on the whole nuclear issue. So it may be that there are many people who would say, let's get out of it right now. I think, in a sense, we're offering the option of hedging your bets and sustaining the capability, but being able to use it for other purposes and having a contingency plan to put it together again, should we develop a nuclear adversary in the future?
Two questions and a comment. I mean, my first question is to Admiral West. Am I right to assume from what he said that he regards the CASD as the minimum feasible deterrent? In other words, despite the fact that he rightly supported very strongly the reductions that were made under the Gordon Brown government, they were quite substantial, as he says. Is his view that that's the end of the process, we can't go further? I've got another question. And then
well, I personally think to go further would, in a military sense...
I'm sorry, could you just maybe hold me...
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to answer that question.
I've got two questions and a comment. Second question...
Because I want you to also address any of the other questions.
Okay. The second question is one of genuine confusion. My broad impression, and I spent a lot of time in the United States, is that almost nobody in the United States would prefer to see Britain retain her deterrent to Britain making a much larger or a substantial contribution to the spectrum of conventional defence. I mean, I've never heard anybody, including President Obama, say that. They are very, very keen indeed to see a major British contribution to conventional capacity. They've seen it and they've approved of it in places like Sierra Leone and so on. But they really don't, I don't think they see a great deal of point in putting all our money into sustaining Trident rather than building up. Now, if I'm wrong, fair enough. I can only say that that's my overwhelming impression, and I think it's one that Nick shares, and I'm slightly surprised that Julian doesn't. Final question, and I agree with what Nick has said. We don't seem to recognise that there's a real crisis in the NPT. That real crisis is on the part of the non-nuclear powers, particularly countries like Indonesia, possibly also Brazil, about, in effect, what will happen if the P5 fail to make some kind of advance in terms of their own disarmament of nuclear weapons and of conventional weapons, particularly nuclear weapons. And I simply cast back the fact that we haven't talked at all about the fact that START 2 enabled us to reduce his 23,000 nuclear weapons by a figure of something like 50%. If only the issue was taken up. It's already been agreed by Russia and the United States, but nothing has gone forward from it. And I don't know why on earth the British government, and for that matter other nuclear weapon countries like France, don't bring pressure to bear to at least reduce the arsenals from the 23,000 at the present time to something more like 8 or 9,000, which is what under START 2 we agreed.
Sorry,
Not at all. I mean, I think, first of all, to Shirley, I do believe that to get rid of our minimum deterrent and CASD actually negates the value of the deterrent to the extent that actually one does have to start thinking about, are we going for a unilateral response? I really do believe that, and I think it's wrong. And in answer to the Pakistani gentleman's points, you know, the existential threat, we don't know what it is. That's all. That's a lot of people have made that point. We no idea what the threat. What will change? We don't know. Once we've lost this skill, and Nick made this point, lost this ability, it's almost impossible to recreate it. Indeed, I have to say, if we did not have nuclear weapons at all, I have to say, with looking at our current finance and everything in this country, I would say it is not worth to start creating them. But we're not in that position. We are where we are. And your point about preemption is absolutely right. You know, having got this, and this is the point of CASD, it is madness for that tiny amount of money, and it sounds a lot if you're trying to build your own local swimming baths, but it is tiny in the public finance arena, to be quite honest. To get rid of that it is silly, and I think Nick does underestimate the difficulty of maintaining your ability to have what is a deterrent that you know works. When you go on your DESO firing with your submarine, our teams and our crews set standards. I mean, we're joined at the hip with the Americans, and this is this point of the nuclear joining, you know, with the Americans. Our firings are absolutely right. They go that range, they hit the target, so anyone knows that it works, and it has to absolutely be known to work, and you do lose those skills if you tie up alongside the wall. Just very quickly on Nick Child's point about the role of the UK, I think we have been bad about identifying that. I think it was not done in the National Security Strategy. We used to have a National Security Forum. We did produce a paper just before the government changed in 2010 about what were these key things written. I don't know where it's gone. It's disappeared into Whitehall somewhere. And I have no doubt that our role is a global role. We are still a great power. No one likes to think of it like that. We are probably the 6th wealthiest nation in the world. We run global shipping from London, and global shipping is the sinew that keeps our little global village together. The fact that you can transport a television set from China to UK at a cost of about 10p is because global shipping runs so efficiently, and it's from here, and the security of it. We've got more investments than any other European country in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Rim. You know, we are still out. We should and need to be outward looking. Those investments have helped us in this current crisis, and if we wish to remain wealthy and secure, we have to look outwards, and I think that means we have to have an outward-looking defence policy. And I think those were the points.
And Julian, you have the last word in this round.
Well, I'm
sorry, there was one more. Could I just very quickly? This issue about... I could not agree more that we do need to have more conventional forces. I agree entirely. But this tiny amount of money is not going to do it. What we have got to do, actually, is say that we're going to spend 2.5% of our GDP on defence. And if that is the prime responsibility of government, as David Cameron said, as Gordon Brown said, as Tony Blair said, as John Major said, as Margaret Thatcher said, then you've got to put your money where your mouth is. This little tiny amount, losing that CASD, is not going to solve that problem. But I agree entirely, we need more.
Julian.
I entirely endorse what Alan has just said. It's an absolute disgrace that a country of the level of influence and with a sense of its own mission that the United Kingdom has is spending so little a proportion of its GDP on defence. Matthew, I'm afraid you're a living proof that I'm obviously not a very good communicator, when you come out with a proposition that the Lib Dems clearly have the most realistic assessment of today's threat. I don't know whether there's any sort of affiliation that might explain that comment of yours, and I don't really wish to know.
Yeah, but then he criticised them.
But, no, I'll come on to that. I'm going to answer that one in a moment. If I have any single message, and in fact it will be two messages, my good friend the speaker, Mr. John Burke, always says that in any oration you must have one main or at most two main points, which you hope your audience might remember in a day or two's time. And my 2 points are, one is that for deterrence to work, it must not only threaten unacceptable damage, but also unavoidable damage. And the other one is that you cannot, and will almost certainly fail to predict the threat before it arises to the point at which it's too late to do anything about it. And I mean, I fear I'd be wasting my breath if you honestly can say at the end of all that that any party has the most realistic assessment of today's threat. The whole point of the message that I'm trying to get through is that we're not just concerned with today's threat, we're concerned with potential threats over the next 50 years, and we cannot possibly know what those will be or when they will arise. We can guess at them, but if you're going to say we've always got to know or have a pretty good idea what sort of aggression is going to hit us a significant time in advance, then frankly you've got no basis for contingency planning at all. Contingency planning implies the ability to meet all sorts of contingencies that might arise. You just don't know what they are, or even if you have a pretty good guess as to what they might be, you don't know when they're going to happen. So why then don't the Liberal Democrats go to full unilateralism? I've already given you the answer to that. And the fact is that during the years that I was campaigning on this subject before I became an MP, I used to commission opinion poll after opinion poll, and the fundamental divide on this issue in the British people is surprisingly unchanging, even with the end of the Cold War. And that is that approximately 2/3 of the British people believe that Britain should continue to have some nuclear weapons as long as other countries have nuclear weapons, and 1/4, which is a very large minority, but it is still a minority, 1/4 of the British people think that it would be desirable to get rid of British nuclear weapons, irrespective of whether other countries have them. And the reason why the Liberals don't go for unilateralism, I'm sorry to be political, but it is a political answer. The reason is that the last party that tried to do that was Labour in the 1983 and 1987 general elections, and we know what happened and why Neil Kinnock, who was a passionate believer in CND, decided that he had to get rid of that policy if he was ever going to get his party elected again. And to his credit, he did.
Chairman, that was at the height of the Cold War.
Of course it was.
When, of course, public opinion was in a very different place from where it is today.
Right.
And Julian decides to interpret the polls and from that to conclude what the Liberal Democrat thinking is. I don't accept these polls that Julian goes around conducting. If you look at reputable published polls on this issue now, not in 1983, now, what it shows is that 2/3 of the country actually want to get rid of nuclear weapons.
I'm sorry,
it's a totally
Nick,
different...
Let's Julian to finish.
I didn't stop your flow, Nick, but I understand why you're extremely touchy and sensitive on this point. I would be too in your position. The fact is that the polling that continued after the end of the Cold War showed this. And what's more, there were no shortage of carefully worded and constructive polls that were carried out during the Cold War years that appeared to make it look as if a majority of people were not in favour of Britain having this system or that system. You can always get those majorities, but I can assure you I've looked at this data, and believe me, if this ever becomes an electoral issue again, I can assure you that preponderance will assert itself. And that is why people know that it is electorally toxic to go to the country with a unilateralist posture, and that's why they try these indirect means of doing it. But coming on to Nick, and I can be very brief now, Nick, you say about the message that we send, the signals that we send to our allies. And my answer to that is, frankly, I'm not interested. The signals I'm interested in sending are the signals we send to our potential enemies. They're the people I want to influence. And as for the question about second strike capabilities, the whole point about this, when people talk about the Cold War posture and the Cold War's ended, we have always had a minimum deterrent. And the reason why, it's in the nature of a mass destruction weapon, that it doesn't matter if your opponent can wipe you out 200 times over, as long as you can, in retaliation and unavoidably, inflict unacceptable damage, which may be much less than what he could do to you, but if he loses half a dozen or a dozen of his main cities, he's not going to attack you. And as for CASD and all the rest of it, just think of this. What we're being asked to do is to make an assessment of who's more likely to be deterred. If someone's going to be more likely to be deterred if he knows that I've got a revolver with 6 chambers in it and 6 bullets and I'm holding it at his heart, or would he be more likely to be deterred if he knew there was only 1 bullet in that gun and that if you spin that chamber, you're not sure whether or not it can even be fired? I know what the answer to that is. I want CASD.
Well, I was planning to go back for one more round, but I promised the panelists that we would finish promptly at 2 o'clock because there is a debate on an important issue on the Ukraine occurring right now in Parliament. And we won't be able to finish if we have 3 more speakers and questions and answers. So I'd like to, if I could, call this discussion to a close right now with apologies to those who I meant to call on, including Hugh Chambers from the RUSI, who has written on the subject of CASD, Malcolm Chalmers, who's also looked at this issue closely, and you, sir, I wanted also to call on you. This has been a marvelous discussion. I think we'd like to continue having these kind of discussions as we move ahead. I appreciate very much the contributions from the members of Parliament who gave up their time for this. And please join me in thanking them, if you would.